Thank you for being here and welcoming me. I live half in England and half in Israel, and actually half on an aeroplane as well. So,
that's true.
Yep. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm an engineer.
Very good. I work a lot with engineers. We stretch the rational mind.
The weirdest thing is I have a very good arm. Like I get insulted right when
Actually, you've brought me right to my starting point. Thank you. I was thinking, now, how shall I start? This is it. This is it. So, yeah, I could start in different ways, but here's one thing. Because I work all over the world, and I work mostly with CEOs and senior teams, and in two top business schools, one in England, one in Switzerland. And I think one of the really interesting things that I keep hearing now, I mean, it started a few years back, but now I hear it all the time, is that the way we've been doing things is struggling to deal with the level of complexity, volatility, rapidity of change. And that's becoming more and more obvious to people, and they're really struggling with that. So that's one context for what I want to talk about. The other parallel thing that's happening, which I think is very, very interesting, is that actually a whole new, it's more than a way of thinking, I would call it more a new kind of consciousness, is coming more and more into the mainstream. And again, this has been there for many years, kind of on the edge, but actually it's coming more and more into the mainstream now. One of the key symptoms of that is this thing called mindfulness. Now this has been around for a while, but actually even in the last 6 months, because I track this a lot, there's an extraordinary acceleration going on. I mean, even in December, I don't know if you saw that CBS 60 Minutes feature with Anderson Cooper, where he went to a weekend with Kabat-Zinn, one of the founders of mindfulness. And, you know, it showed his struggle with it. And then there was a follow-up 2 weeks later, and Anderson Cooper looked into the camera and said, "This has changed my life." And when I saw that, I thought, okay, we are really in the mainstream now. I guess, yeah? I mean, it's your culture, but Anderson Cooper, every time I turn on CNN, Anderson Cooper is there. So I think that's very significant. Very significant. And what I really want to talk to you about today is consciousness, because that's my territory, that's my expertise, and has been for many, many years. And how it started for me was, actually it started when I was age 16, because I had a kind of one of those epiphany, life-changing moments. I won't go into detail about it, but it was like a kind of curtain opening, when I understood that there was far, far more to reality than we're generally taught to believe. And it just became totally clear to me. So in one way or another, ever since then, I've been exploring that. And for many years, actually probably 20, 25 years, I worked in the theatre. And I was a director, and I taught acting at a very high level in the UK. And what I was interested in actually was one thing, which I researched for 25 years. And that one thing was what happened when in a room like this, or a bare room, an actor would cross a threshold and move into something very close to what in sports they call the zone. You're familiar with that term, yeah? People say, wow, I was in the zone, we were in the zone. So when that would happen in a rehearsal room, something really special was happening, because the actor's whole organism, it was like something would open and a kind of very high frequency would come in palpably. And they would be, let's say, working with a Shakespeare speech, and suddenly you were in this huge world. And they would say one line, and the level of intensity or emotion would just knock you sideways. And then if that would happen in a group working together, you would be in a very special atmosphere. And I became really kind of obsessed in a way with not only understanding what this was, because in a way it was self-evident, but actually much more importantly, what was the practice of this? Because we all know, we all touch moments of, I mean, in psychology they call it flow, right? So everyone in this room tastes that more or less frequently. And artists, sports people, that's kind of their holy grail, because that's where they're at their very best. They're most inspired if they're an artist, their highest performance if they're an athlete or whatever. So I became really interested in how do we practice this? Because mostly it's accidental, right? It kind of happens. Oh, you have an interesting practice with Bikram yoga. So over many years I studied this. I studied physical disciplines, yoga, martial arts. I studied psychological disciplines. I studied spiritual disciplines. And gradually I had my own company, and we really kind of evolved a little bit of mastery about this. And I still have vivid memories of these rehearsals, and then even some moments in performance, because it was one thing to do it in a rehearsal room. Then it was another thing, okay, but actually now we have, 100, 500 people here. How do we really make sure that we're in that zone publicly? And of course now top sports teams all have a psychologist. They all have a sports psychologist. And that is the primary thing he or she is working with on them. It's not their technique, that someone else does that, but the primary thing the psychologist will be working on is how do we move into that zone. And then about 15 years ago at least, I started working with executives. I was invited at one of the UK's top business schools to start running programs there, which at first, I confess, I found a very weird and disconcerting change to move from the rehearsal room to a room full of executives, actually very intimidating. But over a few years, we began to develop a methodology with some colleagues that really started to work, and actually then got more and more in demand. And we got so interested in it that a small group of us left the theatre altogether. And that was in 2001. And since then, this has been my full-time work. I do a lot of one-to-one coaching, but mostly I work with teams or groups from organizations. And so I work on helping individuals and teams understand what does it mean to work at a much higher possibility. And this is now, of course, intimately related to the first thing I said. What does it mean to develop a consciousness and a way of working that can work at a much higher level and not only manage things like ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, but actually find them very fertile territory. Because our old consciousness hates ambiguity, right? It hates unknowing. It hates uncertainty. Because our old habits want to fix everything all the time. And therefore it's like the water's flowing and you're trying to fix it, if you're operating in a more traditional way of consciousness. So to use a very simple computer metaphor, I would say that we have bandwidth, and a lot of the old ways organizations have been thinking is like this bandwidth. And actually what's needed now is this bandwidth. And this bandwidth is a practice and actually a total, in some ways, a total change of consciousness. And that's what I would like to talk about today. Because of course, if you're looking at the world with this bandwidth, that's what you call reality. And we should be really clear about that. If you're looking at the world with this bandwidth, reality is totally different. Let's be really clear about that. There is no such thing as reality. Or this bandwidth likes to think there is, of course. That's one of the characteristics of this bandwidth. Yeah, I know what the world is. I know reality. But it's bullshit. It's just like, it's like the interior control department, which operates in all of us, indulging in this fantasy of control, this illusion of control. Because the more we expand our bandwidth, the more we enter a much more multidimensional, richer reality. And then the complexity of the world and the volatility and the unpredictability becomes a very different possibility rather than a problem. Am I making sense so far? Yeah? Good, and so please feel free to interrupt me. I work a lot in Israel, and by now I'd have had 10 questions. No, not 10 questions, 10 objections. 10 arguments. We'd have had 10 arguments. I'm married to an Israeli, so 15 years, I'm just getting used to it. I tell her about the groups, and she says, yeah, but what's, Israelis, the first thing they do is they argue. That's just how it is. So. No, but seriously, please interrupt, because dialogue will be the way we deepen our conversation.
Well, I'll ask you a question.
Yeah.
So, I love the metaphor, the concept of bandwidth.
Right.
The visible, the invisible light, the wavelengths. How else can you sort of describe that? I can see what you're talking about, and intuitively I know what you're talking about, but can you say more?
I'm going to.
Oh, good.
For the next hour and a half. No, but I like your hunger to know more. Yeah. Because this is the critical territory. Yeah. So I want to try and exactly give some more perspective. And we may even, if you're interested, do some simple exercises.